The film begins by showing a small baby tied to a chair in a dark room. She is chained to the same chair for years until she reaches her teenage years in 1970. Her name is Katie, a girl who has been imprisoned in a room since she was 1 year old. Now she is 13, flipping through a magazine looking at photos of people whose body parts have been scribbled on. At that moment, her father, Wesley, enters the room and starts feeding her. But when Katie vomits, Wesley immediately rubs the food all over her face. Meanwhile, her blind mother, Lucy, hears her cries and is deeply disturbed by her husband's cruelty, but Lucy cannot intervene because of her limitations. Wesley then goes into the living room, and Lucy reminds him of his promise to free Katie once she turned 12. However, Wesley ignores her and instead points a gun at her. The next morning, after Wesley leaves the house, Lucy quickly wakes up her son and they head to Katie's room. They pull Katie out of her crib and change her clothes. Lucy then takes her daughter to the welfare office, holding her arm. Katie's horrible condition is noticed by the social worker, who promptly contacts the authorities. Shortly after, Wesley is arrested and charged with child abuse. In the next scene, Wesley returns home after posting bail and cries as the news broadcasts their story. The next day, when Lucy and her lawyer go to the courthouse, they are surrounded by media. Lucy's lawyer asserts that Lucy is innocent and was also abused by her husband. Meanwhile, Wesley, unable to bear the humiliation and shame, shoots himself and leaves only a note saying the world would never understand his feelings. Soon after, Katie is taken to a hospital where a team of professionals gathers to help her. Dr. Norman immediately enlists a linguistics student named Sandra, along with her friend Dr. Stan, to assess Katie's condition. Before conducting tests, Sandra kneels in front of Katie, who curiously touches her face and hair. Now, Stan and Sandra begin to investigate while teaching Katie how to interact and behave. Katie sneezes rudely, so Stan teaches her the proper way to sneeze by covering her nose with a tissue. At lunch, Stan teaches Katie how to chew her food after realizing that she wasn't given enough time to chew at home. In class, Sandra notices Katie talking with her special education teacher named Judy. Judy praises Katie when she successfully answers a question, even repeating the word "good" to her teacher. Judy then complains to Sandra about how the hospital receives so much funding, but chooses to work with graduate students rather than professionals. Sandra clarifies that she is not Katie's teacher and is only there to document her progress, but Judy boldly claims that she will teach Katie to speak and make her famous. The next day, Sandra and Dr. Stan meet Lucy in the cafeteria. Sandra asks the doctor if she can question Lucy about her daughter's past and why she was isolated, but Stan advises her to be patient, as the court has determined that Lucy was not a perpetrator, but rather a victim. They then take Katie out, and during the trip, they are shocked to see Katie touching herself in the back seat. A little while later, they arrive at a store where Katie heads to the meat section and grabs a piece for herself. When the butcher notices this, he hands the little girl some raw meat, which Katie sniffs while Sandra and Stan observe her. A few days later, the team places Katie in the hospital's specialized care and connects her to an EEG machine to test her brain activity. Afterward, she wakes up, frightened, as she looks around and raises her hands. Sandra enters the room and calms Katie by singing her a lullaby, which makes Katie smile. For the first time, she calls Sandra by her name. Meanwhile, the doctor presents a report indicating that Katie might have experienced developmental delays since birth. Later, Stan and Sandra take Katie for a walk outside and discuss her vocabulary to determine whether the doctor's indications are accurate. While they chat, Katie moves toward a room and a dog starts barking at her. This reminds her of when her father used to scare her by growling like a dog, and Katie begins to panic and scratch herself. Later in hospital, Judy approaches Katie and invites her to stay overnight at her house. Sandra becomes suspicious of Judy's invitation, believing that she is only using Katie for fame. However, Katie seems to agree with Judy's offer and goes to spend the night at her house. The next morning, Sandra learns that Katie is in quarantine at Judy's home after contracting rubella. Sandra complains to Norman about this, but Norman insists that they should keep the girl at Judy's house, as they don't want to risk infecting other children at the hospital. A few days later, when Sandra visits Judy's home to check on Katie, she is amazed by the girl's progress and praises Judy's efforts. While discussing Katie, Judy mentions her tendency to touch herself, suggesting that Katie learned it from adults. However, Sandra disagrees, claiming that even newborns exhibit similar behaviors. The next morning, Stan reveals that Judy has accused him of abusing Katie, and he is forced to resign because of the accusation. Sandra immediately goes to Judy's house to confront her about the issue, but Judy tells her that Katie is tired of her visits and asks her to stop coming by. Sandra then complains to Norman, still concerned about Katie, and Norman reveals that he and his wife plan to adopt the little girl. Soon after, Norman arrives to greet Katie, but Judy blames him for taking Katie away from a proper home and threatens him. At Norman's house, Katie picks up a magazine and sees photos of dogs, which trigger her anxiety. She quickly throws it away and starts scratching herself. Meanwhile, Norman's wife, Beverly, notices this behavior. To calm Katie down, Beverly starts hitting a pillow, showing her an alternative way to express her anger. A few days later, Lucy, who recently underwent surgery to restore her eyesight, comes to visit Katie at the house. When Katie reaches for applesauce at the dining table, Beverly and Sandra encourage her to ask for it vocally. However, Lucy gets upset and tells Sandra not to force Katie if she doesn't want to. After Lucy leaves, Beverly senses that Lucy might be frustrated, possibly out of jealousy over others playing the role of Katie's mother. Norman agrees, thinking Lucy likely feels powerless. The next morning, Beverly wakes Katie up for breakfast and notices that Katie has just had her first period. When Sandra visits later, Beverly tells her about Katie's menstruation and her daily routine. Katie then starts attending a children's playgroup, meeting younger classmates. On the school bus, she grows attached to the bus driver, Kurt, refusing to let go of him. A few days later, Sandra teaches Katie to form sentences, but the little girl struggles greatly with it. When Norman arrives, he sees that specialists from the National Institute of Mental Health have come to assess their research on Katie. While they are talking, Katie suddenly spits on the floor, and Sandra scolds her for her bad behavior. That night, Norman tells Sandra that their research wasn't well received by the specialists, and he begins to worry. At that moment, Sandra plays a song on the piano that reminds Katie of the times Wesley used to beat her. Sandra notices that the girl is scared but cannot express her feelings. The next day, Sandra takes Katie and Lucy to the beach, hoping to lift Katie's mood and make her feel better. While Katie is busy playing, Lucy tells Sandra that Wesley used to beat Katie if she made any noise. To silence her, Wesley would hit her with a stick or growl like a dog, which explains her fear of dogs. That night, Sandra introduces her boyfriend Rob to Katie, and Katie is thrilled to have a new friend, even showing Rob something she had sewn. Shortly after, Sandra reviews her documents and realizes that Katie hasn't made much progress. Sandra tells Norman that while Katie is learning new words, she still cannot form grammatically correct sentences. However, Sandra recalls that Katie communicates primarily through touch and gestures, so they decide to teach Katie sign language, which she quickly learns. Unfortunately, Katie's lessons are cut short, and she is sent back to live with her mother. Norman sends Katie back to Lucy's house, where she now has a better bedroom, but Katie starts crying when she hears Norman leaving. A few days later, Sandra visits Lucy and informs her that she has submitted a funding proposal to work with Katie again. However, Lucy has already decided to send Katie to a children's educational institution because she worries that an institution might hinder Katie's progress. Sandra proposes that Katie be placed in foster care instead, and Lucy eventually agrees. Katie is soon placed with her new foster family, the Mannings, but this family is very strict. They won't allow Katie to wear jewelry or use sign language. One day, Katie vomits while eating because she finds the food disgusting, and her caretaker punishes her harshly. That night, Sandra visits Katie, but the foster parents insist that Katie is not allowed to see anyone as punishment. When Sandra brings up Katie's past, the Mannings dismiss it, saying all their foster children come from troubled backgrounds but they don't behave like animals. This prompts Sandra to check on Katie, but Katie refuses to speak, fearing she might vomit again. Sandra then calls Norman, asking him to help get Katie out of the Mannings' care, and Norman quickly agrees. In the meantime, Sandra returns to the Mannings, but since Katie refuses to open her mouth, Sandra struggles to feed her. A few days later, Sandra asks the social worker responsible for Katie to move her immediately, as Katie refuses to speak or eat. However, the social worker believes it's Katie's fault and refuses to take any action. When Sandra returns to see Katie, she realizes that the girl has hurt herself. Finally, Norman steps in and allows Katie to be returned to the hospital. Sandra now consults with Amanda, who is responsible for Katie's case, and suggests that Katie stay with her since they get along well. Sandra discusses this with Rob, but Rob thinks it's not a good idea because Sandra is still in college. When Sandra returns to the hospital to visit Katie, she finds that Lucy has already taken her. Sandra quickly goes to meet Lucy, who reveals that she has placed Katie in a location of her choosing far away. Lucy accuses Sandra of treating Katie like an experiment and forbids Sandra and the rest of the team from seeing her daughter again. Sandra knows she can't fight Lucy, so she asks why Wesley isolated Katie for so many years. Lucy explains that no one understood Wesley except his mother, whom he admired more than anything. But everything changed when his mother was hit by a car while crossing the street. After that, they moved into his mother's house, and Wesley began sleeping in her old room, while Lucy and Katie slept in the living room. Katie was given her own room, where she was imprisoned for years. A doctor told them that Katie was developmentally delayed, so Wesley locked her away to avoid the authorities who might discover her condition and take her away. At the same time, Lucy started going blind, so Wesley became Katie's primary caregiver. As Sandra leaves Lucy's house, she sees Judy approaching. It becomes clear to Sandra that Lucy believes Judy's accusations against her and the team. Before Judy enters the house, she gets into an emotional argument with Sandra. Later, Sandra watches old tapes to relive her memories with Katie, as she is no longer allowed to see her. A few years pass, and Sandra expresses her good wishes for Katie, believing that she has left Katie with memories she can cherish. Sandra is shown holding her newborn baby, singing a lullaby to her, while it is revealed that Sandra is still forbidden from seeing Katie, who now lives in a nearby foster home. Meanwhile, Judy continues to accuse Sandra and her team. This film is based on the true story of a girl named Jeannie Wiley, who was a child but extremely feral in modern times. The film is told from the perspective of Susan Curtis, whose fictional name in the movie is Sandra, a linguistics professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. Although the film is based on a true story, all the characters' names have been fictionalized for legal reasons. And that's it for the story series of this film. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to support this channel by subscribe, like and share. See you in the next video. Goodbye.